Mm, we don't shrink the shape of thought or sand the edges of what we sought. Every silence carries meaning, even pauses still are speaking. Every word is given room to
Okay,
arrive
all right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this
because we
third episode of Echoes of
already
Change
are.
Culture Influx
Not
podcast.
rehearsed, not
The hard part is
cynical.
behind us.
Time loosens its
That is
grip
the good
on the
news. We
gentle
have
pace.
now 2
Don't
hours and
rewind,
20 minutes
don't
behind
replace.
us
You're
where we
not
have
broken,
had a
not
lot of
late,
input,
not lost.
where we have
No,
discussed
you're
about
present, you're
a very, very wide and deep
here.
topics.
No
And now we
excuses, no
still have
scars,
1 hour,
no
but an
refrain,
interesting
no
one because we are going to do the
sideways.
psychology. We are going
Just
to
a
play
voice that
psychology for the
stands
next
still,
hour.
long
So,
enough to
before
know
we
that
move on,
truth
I would like to
will be
mention something, or I would like to bring up another topic, not another topic actually very related to this one, but let's say an addition. We keep hearing the word language, communication, language, communication. I think it is important for me to state here that it keeps coming because language does more than just carry meaning from one person to another. Language is actually responsible or part of the team, cognitive team that is responsible to organize our cognition, our identity, as well as our social life. If you go out there and you do a little bit of research, you will notice that contemporary researchers have now put out their findings that are well established, stating that language has two layers that are very important. The first one would be the framing of the message. Why? Because the framing of the message, truth, for example, word, the grammar, the metaphor, systematically shapes how people think, how people feel, and what they decide to do. That's the first layer. Then the second layer is the structure of the language, which, for example, influences our perception and mental representation of our reality. Depending of the language I am speaking, therefore also the reality around me will be shaped in a certain way or manner. So the structure of a language matters. I want you really at the end of this chapter or section or episode to go out and to understand a little bit more about the framing. When I send out an emoji, when I send out a smiley emoji, or when I send out, let's say, question marks, this is the framing. And what does that do to the person in front of me who is at the receiving end of that message? Without taking much more time, let us start by stating again what the goal of this section, what the goal of this chapter is. And I hope you enjoy this part. I hope you enjoy this chapter. And yeah, let us dive into it.
Held with care, finds a place to stay somewhere. We
The
say
goal with this
hello,
chapter.
not to
This
impress,
chapter takes that
but to
structural map
ignore
and asks the human question:
unexpressed.
what do these
Some
linguistic forms and
regrets
choices do
allow
to the mind
instincts
and to
and
identity?
thought
Here we
finish
draw on established
slowly.
research to show how message framing
We
shapes
just want to
judgments
be
and emotions,
saved, not
how
supposed to
linguistic categories guide
know the
perception and
way.
mental
But
timelines,
moving
and how language
away
functions as a
goes
cognitive
so
scaffold for
near
attention,
and
memory, and problem solving.
we
What
don't
follows this
stand
episode
up
is the
with
closing movement of the series, and it requires a foundation that is both scientific and carefully prepared. My task here is simply to give you enough ground to understand why we must spend time with cognition, framing, and identity before we approach the final topic. The next episode examines a broad cultural pattern shaping much of contemporary global communication, a pattern whose full contours will be explored only when this series concludes. For now, what matters is that identity, belonging, and emotional expression increasingly unfold inside environments marked by visibility, persistent memory, and complex audiences. Communication psychology shows that under such conditions, individuals adjust tone, stance, and self presentation in ways that reflect not only preference, but also self protection. This chapter therefore functions as a bridge. By clarifying how language shapes thought and identity, we prepare you and ourselves, frankly, to understand how those same mechanisms respond when the social environment changes. This episode, therefore, lays the scientific groundwork. The next will examine the cultural consequences. The central thesis. Language is often described as a neutral tool, something external that we pick up to convey thoughts that already exist in fully formed shape. Yet in cognitive science and communication psychology, the evidence points to a different, far more consequential reality. Language is not simply a medium of expression, it is a cognitive engine. It shapes the structures through which we interpret experience, the emotional tone with which we store memories, the relational cues through which we signal belonging, and the boundaries through which we differentiate ourselves and others. This means that every linguistic choice, a framing, a metaphor, a stance, a tone, or a multimodal expression, participates in building the internal architecture through which the world becomes legible. It is not merely that we speak, it is that our speaking continuously shapes the categories available to our thinking. To make this principle tangible rather than abstract, consider the following reconstructible situation. The goal is not drama. It is to reveal the invisible mechanisms that operate inside ordinary life, where language does its deepest psychological work. A reconstructible scene, the cognitive engine in motion. Imagine a family gathered around a dinner table at the end of an ordinary weekday. The setting is familiar, the routines well established, and the atmosphere steady, not tense, not celebratory, simply normal. This is precisely the kind of moment where linguistic mechanisms are most instructive, because their effects unfold quietly, without spectacle, yet with unmistakable influence. The eldest daughter, feeling the weight of recent comparisons, begins the conversation gently. "I don't know. I feel like I'm falling behind." Without raising her voice, she introduces a frame in which time is competitive, progress is measured relatively, and identity becomes evaluative. Her words carry the cognitive architecture of self-comparison, an internalized timeline, an imagined peer group, and the fear of deviation from a normative path. The moment she speaks, the psychological landscape around the table reorganizes itself according to that frame. Her mother responds with practiced instinct, leaning forward in an attempt to soften the terrain. "You're not falling behind. You're moving at your own rhythm. Everyone's path is different." The mother's language replaces the competitive frame with a pluralistic one. Time shifts from linear ranking to individualized pacing. Her intent is reassurance, but what she actually changes is the conceptual model through which the daughter interprets her own position in life. The brother steps in with a different strategy, using humor to diffuse the emotional weight. "Honestly, nobody has it figured out. We're all improvising." His sentence performs several functions at once. It reframes adulthood as a domain of uncertainty rather than achievement. It invites a form of belonging organized around shared confusion rather than individual deficit. It also signals a generational stance, self-protection through irony, solidarity through understatement, and alignment through linguistic lightness. The father, after listening quietly, anchors the discussion in a more normative frame. "Improvising is fine, but you still need direction. You can't drift forever." With this line, he introduces a boundary, not an emotional one, but a social and developmental one. He reframes the moment around responsibility, thresholds, and expectations. His language implicitly defines what adulthood should look like within the family's shared worldview. What is striking about this scene is not the variety of opinions, but the variety of linguistic worlds produced in less than a minute. Nothing about the daughter's objective circumstances has changed. What has changed, repeatedly, is the cognitive landscape constructed through each person's phrasing. The daughter's frame of deficit, the mother's frame of individualized time, the brother's frame of collective uncertainty, the father's frame of responsibility and boundaries. Each frame mobilizes a different emotional economy, a different model of adulthood, a different invitation to belonging, and a different boundary of identity. These frames do not simply describe reality. They shape how reality is experienced, recalled, and integrated into one sense of self. This is the central thesis in motion. Language does not mirror thought, it organizes it. Language does not reveal identity, it constructs the categories through which identity becomes possible. Language does not merely comment on social boundaries, it actively builds and maintains them. The dinner table scene is unremarkable, and that is precisely why it is powerful. It demonstrates how the psychological mechanisms of language operate inside the smallest moments of daily life, creating meaning, modulating emotional tone, signaling group roles, and shaping the narratives through which people understand themselves and one another. Everything that follows in this episode builds on that recognition that the relationship between language, thought, and identity is not incidental, but foundational. Our claim. Every argument in this chapter rests on a straightforward promise. The psychological mechanisms we examine are not intuitive impressions or speculative ideas. They are the product of decades of convergent research across 5 scientific disciplines. Each field approaches language from a different angle, yet they all arrive at the same conclusion, that linguistic structure is inseparable from cognitive, emotional, and social life. The brief illustrations that follow are not meant to exhaust that research, only to signal the grounding on which the episode stands. Psycholinguistics, how language guides cognitive processes. If you observe how children learn to speak, you also observe how they learn to think. Psycholinguistics shows that linguistic patterns serve as early scaffolding for memory, categorization, and the structuring of experience. Infants rely on the rhythms and distinctions of their native language to sort information and form recall patterns, demonstrating that cognition develops with linguistic structure, not after it. This field gives us the first piece of evidence. Language is not added to thought, it is woven into it. Cognitive science, how framing generates mental models. When cognitive scientists study framing, they study the way language builds mental architecture. A familiar example appears in health communication. Describing an illness as a battle leads people to imagine threat, conflict, and fixed outcomes, while calling it a journey evokes movement, adaptation, and possibility, even when both descriptions refer to the same condition. These shifts are not stylistic. They demonstrate that thought follows the structure that language provides. Communication psychology, how language shapes belonging and interpretation. In interpersonal settings, language accomplishes more than conveying meaning. It organizes the emotional atmosphere through tone, pacing, and gesture. Communication psychology repeatedly shows that most communicative impact arises from these formal cues rather than from literal content. This is what allows individuals to sense acceptance, distance, reassurance, or critique long before explicit meaning is parsed. Belonging is negotiated through linguistic form. Cross-cultural psychology, how language and culture co-construct identity. Across cultures, language reflects and reinforces the worldview that a community holds. For instance, speakers of Mandarin often map time vertically, up and down, which shapes how they reason about temporal progression. Such examples reveal how language and culture operate as a loop. Linguistic categories guide cognition, while cultural norms guide which categories matter. Framing research, how small linguistic choices influence emotion and judgment. Framing studies add precision to the broader story. Even small changes in wording, a metaphor, a description, a syntactic shift, can produce measurable differences in emotional response and decision-making. This has been observed in domains ranging from public health to policy communication and even interpersonal advice. Framing research, therefore, gives us the mechanism behind the influence. Language shapes the interpretive lens through which meaning is received. Summary of the claim of this chapter. Across these 5 bodies of research, the conclusion is consistent and empirically grounded. Linguistic structures, choices, and metaphors do not merely transfer information. They shape the cognitive and emotional frameworks through which individuals think, remember, belong, differentiate themselves, and understand the boundaries that structure social life. This is the foundation that allows the rest of the episode to unfold with clarity and credibility. Now, let's continue with how language shapes thought, cognitive foundations. A linguistic framing effects, message interpretation. One of the most robust findings across cognitive science, psychology, and communication research is that the human mind does not receive information neutrally. It receives information framed, wrapped in linguistic structure that quietly signals how the situation should be understood. Framing occurs every time we describe an event, set a tone, choose a metaphor, or select a grammatical structure. These linguistic choices do not sit on the surface of communication. They shape the interpretive pathway the mind enters. The mechanism is straightforward. Language pre-structures meaning. Before we evaluate a situation, before we form an opinion, before we remember anything, the frame of the message has already begun to guide which dimensions feel relevant, which emotions become activated, and which actions appear reasonable. This is why framing is often called the architecture of interpretation. The words do not simply describe reality, they design the entry point through which reality will be perceived. A large 2024 integrative review of framing research, spanning politics, health, journalism, and interpersonal communication, confirms that even small linguistic shifts can meaningfully alter people's judgments, emotional reactions, and decisions. This is true across cultures, across age groups, and across contexts, which is why framing is considered a core cognitive mechanism, not a marginal linguistic effect. Why framing alters decisions and perception. A frame does 3 things automatically. It selects what is salient. The frame tells the listener what matters before they have consciously decided what matters. It activates a schema. Frames draw on pre-existing mental models: fight, journey, crisis, opportunity, each of which comes with an emotional pattern, a cognitive structure, and an implied storyline. It shapes emotional expectation. This happens instantly, before analysis, before deliberation. And once the emotional expectation is set, the cognition that follows is guided by it. The strongest real-world example, cancer as battle versus journey. Among the many demonstrations found in the scientific literature, one stands out for its clarity and global recognizability. When cancer is described as a battle, people imagine an enemy, a fight, personal strength versus weakness, winning and losing, success and failure. This frame increases perceived fatality, emotional pressure, and the sense of personal responsibility for the outcome, even when medical realities remain unchanged. This effect has been empirically demonstrated in multiple studies and cited in the major 2024 review. By contrast, describing cancer as a journey activates a completely different mental model. Movement, progression, adaptation over time, phases rather than outcomes, continuity rather than combat. Here, people interpret the experience with more psychological spaciousness and perceive greater agency. In both cases, the facts do not change, the diagnosis does not change, the reality does not change. What changes is the linguistic frame, and that frame creates a different cognitive world. This is linguistic framing at work. Language alters the conceptual structure through which reality is understood. How framing works in everyday life. Framing is not limited to health communication or public policy. It operates constantly in ordinary life. Even the difference between saying, "Everything fell apart today," versus "Today was messy, but I kept moving," produces two different cognitive and emotional landscapes. The first frame creates a narrative of collapse. The second creates a narrative of resilience. In interpersonal communication with partners, colleagues, friends, framing determines whether conflict escalates or softens, whether vulnerability feels welcome or unsafe, whether a situation feels solvable or catastrophic. People often believe they are reacting to events, but they are usually reacting to frames. Why framing must come first in this episode. Framing is the first cognitive foundation of the entire topic because it shows how language shapes thought at the moment of perception. It demonstrates that cognitive interpretation is linguistically primed. It prepares the listener to understand later sections on identity, belonging, and social boundaries, and it establishes the scientific principle that will underlie the whole episode. All language constructs the mental architecture through which we navigate the world. Once framing is in place, the rest of the cognitive mechanisms, relativity, scaffolding, group formation, stratification, identity construction, can be understood with precision. B. Metaphors rewire mental models. Metaphors are often treated as stylistic devices, yet in cognitive science they function as structural templates, compact mental models that guide interpretation long before conscious reasoning begins. Decades of empirical research demonstrate that metaphors supply the mind with a ready-made schema, one that shapes how people perceive causality, agency, emotion, and responsibility. The clearest illustration remains the contrast between describing cancer as a battle versus a journey. When framed as a battle, listeners imagine conflict, enemies, strength, weakness, and the possibility of defeat. When framed as a journey, they imagine phases, movement, adaptation, and continuity. The same. Diagnosis produces different cognitive landscapes simply because the metaphor changes. A second line of research shows how metaphors guide reasoning about social problems. In a widely replicated psychological experiment, describing crime as a beast preying on the city led participants to support punitive enforcement, whereas describing it as a virus infecting the city led to support for systemic reform, despite identical crime statistics. The metaphor changed the mental model. A beast invites capture, a virus invites treatment. Perception and policy preference followed the metaphor, not the data. A second line of research shows how metaphors guide reasoning about social problems. In a widely replicated psychological experiment, describing crime as a beast preying on the city led participants to support punitive enforcement, whereas describing it as a virus infecting the city led to support for systemic reform, despite identical crime statistics. The metaphor changed the mental model. A beast invites capture, a virus invites treatment. Perception and policy preference followed the metaphor, not the data. Metaphors also shape how individuals understand themselves. Everyday expressions like, "I've hit a wall," "I'm turning a corner," or "I'm entering a new chapter" activate specific internal narratives. A wall metaphor signals obstruction and stagnation. A corner signals transition. A chapter implies continuity and authorship. These linguistic structures influence how people remember setbacks, how they interpret effort, and how they locate themselves within longer-term identity stories. Even without explicit intention, metaphors quietly steer how individuals assign meaning to their own development. And cross-cultural psychology further shows that metaphors embed themselves into the perceptual fabric of entire linguistic communities. English speakers typically imagine time horizontally, projecting the future ahead and the past behind, while Mandarin speakers frequently use vertical metaphors, positioning the future downward. Similarly, emotional metaphors such as feeling down, low, uplifted, or on top of things reveal how spatial schemas shape effective interpretation. These metaphors organize cognition at the level of basic perceptual mapping. Taken together, these findings demonstrate a single coherent principle. Metaphors are not accessories to thought. They are the cognitive frameworks that determine how thought becomes possible. They determine what the mind expects, what it prioritizes, what it fears, what it hopes for, and how it interprets the actions of others. The metaphor does not simply comment on reality. It builds the version of reality the listener enters. Why this matters digitally. Digital environments do not simply transmit language, they compress it. They accelerate it, fragment it, and surround it with multimodal cues that must be interpreted in seconds. In such conditions, the cognitive mechanisms we have just examined do not weaken, they intensify. A frame that might once have been softened by context, pacing, or tone becomes the dominant architecture of interpretation when delivered through short-form text, clipped audio, or image-based templates. A metaphor that might once have operated quietly in the background becomes the primary organizing principle for meaning when a message arrives stripped of surrounding nuance. Online, metaphors and frames function as cognitive shortcuts. They fill the space where context used to be, where a face-to-face conversation provides tone, posture, and shared timing. A digital message arrives as a condensed signal that must instantly resolve ambiguity. The mind relies on whatever linguistic structure is available, often a single word, a visual template, or a caption rhythm, to determine the emotional and interpretive stance. Hashtags and templates intensify this effect. A hashtag does not merely categorize content, it supplies an interpretive frame that precedes the message. Hashtag fail, hashtag glow up, hashtag adulting, or hashtag protect Black women function as compact schemas that tell the mind what kind of meaning it is about to receive. A repeating meme format, a split-screen reaction, a stitched video, a familiar caption structure provides a well-worn cognitive model into which new content is placed, often without the listener consciously noticing the mapping. To see how this operates in real digital life, imagine opening a message thread where a friend shares a short clip of their day and captions it simply, "Me surviving another meeting." The clip may show nothing dramatic, perhaps a tired expression, a coffee cup, a slow exhale, but the word surviving activates a metaphorical frame. The mind maps the ordinary inconvenience onto a structure of endurance, resilience, and struggle. In seconds, meaning is constructed. The situation lacks literal danger, yet the metaphor cues the emotional reading. If the same clip carried the caption, "Me navigating another meeting," the cognitive map would shift. Now the moment becomes a process, a movement through complexity rather than a battle against it. The content is identical. The frame reshapes its reality. This is the everyday dramaturgy of digital meaning making. The velocity of communication demands immediate interpretation, and the absence of physical cues means linguistic form carries the entire cognitive load. The mind relies on metaphors, frames, and templates not because they are decorative, but because they are the most efficient tools available within digital constraints. Online, these structures do not supplement thought. They become the scaffolding through which thought occurs. This dynamic is essential to understanding digital identity and digital belonging. Short-form communication privileges the linguistic devices that most efficiently shape perception: metaphors, frames, and templates. As a result, the psychological influence of language becomes more concentrated, not less. Digital communication creates a world where meaning is not discovered slowly, but assembled rapidly, through the smallest linguistic signals, each one shaping how individuals interpret themselves, others, and the groups to which they believe they belong. Now, linguistic relativity, structure perception. Starting with color perception, how language trains the eye. The principle of linguistic relativity begins most visibly with color. The spectrum of visible light is constant, yet the perceptual world people inhabit is not. Languages do not merely assign labels to colors, they carve reality into categories. Those categories, once learned, alter how individuals distinguish, remember, and respond to what they see. Research on the Himba people of Namibia illustrates this with particular clarity. Their language divides the color spectrum differently from English, grouping together shades that English speakers separate and separating hues that English collapses into a single term. When tested, Himba speakers reliably distinguish between shades of green and blue that many English speakers perceive as nearly identical, while English speakers excel at distinctions that the Himba linguistic system treats as belonging to a single category. The eye has not changed, the perceptual grid supplied by language has. What this reveals is a core psychological mechanism, categorical perception. When a language offers fine-grained lexical categories, the mind becomes perceptually primed, more attentive to differences, quicker to discriminate them, and more likely to remember them later. When a language fuses distinctions, the perceptual system follows that fusion. This phenomenon is often described as perceptual readiness, the mind's tendency to organize sensory input according to the categories it has been trained to expect. Color perception is not only visual, it is conceptual. Languages across cultures map emotion onto color, feeling blue, seeing red, turning white with fear, and these metaphors shape emotional interpretation as surely as color terms shape visual discrimination. Metaphor research confirms that these linguistic structures alter how individuals interpret emotional states and make decisions. The emotional palette is, in this sense, as linguistically mediated as the visual one. Cross-cultural psychology reinforces this point. Linguistic categories interact with cultural norms to shape not only what people see, but what they consider meaningful. Cultural values determine which distinctions matter and which remain invisible. Language follows those priorities, and perception follows language.
Okay, all right. So, thank you very much. We have now more than 30 minutes that have passed. I would suggest that we take a break now. It is time to have a small break again, a quick one this time because we are almost at the end. We are almost done, so we don't want to lose time because again today has been very extensive. Let us have a small break, and right after the break, we come back and continue. Okay, enjoy.
Noise I barely notice, built-in rules, invisible codes. We were taught the lines, we repeat them. Not sure who decided where they go. World spins fast, it's loud and layered. Every screen tells me who to be, but somewhere in this rush of answers, there's a question breathing quietly. I make choices every day, A instead of B, but do I know why? Something shapes me under the skin. Old stories whisper, bending my mind. If I stop and listening, past and future tangle in the light. Maybe I'm not just one thing, maybe me is more than meets the eye. We are more than echoes, echoes, shouting from the years behind. All the faces in our photo frames, living in the way we jacket, frayed old wristband still on my sleeve. Every habit, every reflex is a thread from somebody's hand. Still I'm drawing something different, sketching futures in the sand. I feel patterns in my veins, roots they walk before me in the dark. But I'm turning corners slow, chalking out my own small mark. What's if I stay awake tonight? Baby, I can learn to hold both sides, all the way to where I'm from and the wow to what I've yet to find. We are more than echoes, echoes shouting from the years behind. All the faces in photo frames living in the.
This mechanism extends far beyond color. The same cognitive principle underlies how Mandarin speakers conceptualize time vertically, future events positioned downward, while English speakers imagine time moving horizontally ahead. Color, time, space, emotion, each becomes perceptually structured through the linguistic categories available in a given culture. In digital environments, this mechanism operates with new constraints. Platforms impose their own taxonomies through tags, filters, color coding, and visual templates. The distinctions the interface emphasizes become the distinctions users notice. The categories it collapses become the ones users overlook. Just as the Himba linguistic system trains perception in the offline world, digital taxonomies shape perception in the online one. Color perception is the doorway into linguistic relativity, a simple, vivid example of a much larger principle. Language does not merely describe the world, it trains the mind to perceive it. Spatial reasoning, how language orients the mind in the world. If color perception reveals how language can tune the eye, spatial reasoning shows how language can orient the entire body in the world. Every language must solve the problem of describing where things are, but the system it uses shapes not only communication, but cognition itself. Many familiar Indo-European languages, including English, organize space egocentrically. Objects are to my left, behind you, in front of us. Space reconfigures itself each time the body turns. The reference point is always the self. This creates a spatial world that is fluid, shifting, and tied to personal perspective. Other languages adopt a radically different system. They rely on cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, even in everyday conversation. Speakers of these geocentric languages do not say, "The cup is to your left," but "the cup is southeast of you." They do not turn left, but turn westward. Direction is encoded as a stable property of the world, not as a subjective position of the body. This linguistic structure produces a striking cognitive effect. Research consistently shows that speakers of cardinal direction languages demonstrate unusually strong spatial navigation abilities, often outperforming speakers of left-right languages, even in unfamiliar or indoor environments. Their linguistic system requires constant orientation, and over time, this becomes a cognitive reflex. In one widely cited experimental paradigm, participants were brought into a windowless room, rotated several times, and then asked to point north. Speakers of cardinal direction languages did so effortlessly, as if the cognitive map of the world had remained anchored even after disorientation. Speakers of left-right languages performed no better than random chance. The environment was identical, only the linguistic encoding differed. This phenomenon reveals an important psychological mechanism: categorical versus coordinate spatial systems. Egocentric languages create fluid spatial categories dependent on the body's shifting orientation. Geocentric languages create stable spatial categories anchored to the external world. These categories shape not only how individuals navigate, but how they remember events, describe experiences, and construct identity. A navigational world that remains constant regardless of personal movement produces a different experience of being in the world than a navigational world that rearranges itself each time the body turns. At the level of identity, this emerges subtly through metaphors. I feel lost. I need direction. I'm trying to stay grounded. These phrases are not neutral. They map psychological experience onto spatial schemas that differ across cultures. A person raised in a cardinal direction language may understand direction literally as a fixed coordinate in a stable world, while a speaker of an egocentric language may understand direction as something that shifts with internal state. This distinction also helps illuminate certain digital dynamics. Digital interfaces impose their own spatial conventions. Feeds scroll downward. Menus remain left anchored. Notifications appear top right. These patterns create a stable, predictable spatial world in which users develop strong interface navigation abilities, a digital analog to geocentric cognition. Over time, users orient themselves within apps not through introspection but through external coordinates established by the interface. Upward for history, downward for the future, left for navigation menus, right for actions. Digital platforms, in this sense, become microgeographies with their own spatial grammars. Spatial reasoning, therefore, demonstrates a key insight of linguistic relativity. The structure of a language does not merely describe space, it trains the mind to inhabit space in particular ways. The coordinates available in language become the coordinates available in cognition, shaping how individuals navigate the physical world, the digital world, and the internal landscape of experience. Temporal reasoning, how language shapes the experience of time. If color perception shows how language guides what we see, and spatial reasoning shows how it orients where we are, temporal reasoning reveals how language shapes our understanding of when things are. Time is not encountered directly, it is conceptualized. And the structure a language offers for expressing temporal relations has measurable effects on how speakers imagine the flow of events. English places time horizontally, the future ahead, the past behind, progress as forward motion. This mapping shapes everyday gestures and narrative expectations. Mandarin frequently encodes time vertically, earlier events up, later events down. Speakers often imagine temporal sequences top to bottom rather than left to right, and gesture accordingly. Cross-cultural studies confirm that these patterns influence how people arrange timelines, recall event order, and understand temporal movement. These are not stylistic quirks, but cognitive coordinates. A horizontal timeline privileges metaphors of momentum and obstacle. A vertical one privileges metaphors of rise and fall. Each generates its own emotional coloration of planning, regret, and change. Temporal reasoning, therefore, reveals an essential truth. The structure of time in the mind follows the structure of time in language. Why this matters digitally: new cognitive lenses in online environments. Up to this point, we have looked at how natural languages shape temporal cognition. But digital environments introduce something fundamentally different. They create new temporal structures altogether, structures no spoken language has ever encoded, yet which billions of people now internalize daily. Where linguistic systems evolve slowly over centuries, digital interfaces impose temporal grammars instantly. And because the digital world restricts context, accelerates exposure, and reorganizes sequence, its temporal patterns become cognitive defaults just as powerful as linguistic ones. 3 mechanisms illustrate this shift. Scroll-based perception. The dominant motion of digital life is downward. Yesterday appears above. Tomorrow loads below. This interface logic produces a global verticality of time, not linguistically learned, but experientially absorbed. Feed-based temporal mapping. Feeds do not move forward. They refresh. Novelty appears without transition, sequence, or anticipation, creating a temporal experience that is discontinuous and fragmented, unlike linear, embodied time. Meme-based conceptual shorthand. Memes compress time into micro-narratives that structure emotional interpretation instantly. They create condensed timelines that function as shared cognitive shortcuts. Taken together, these mechanisms demonstrate that digital platforms are not merely informational systems, they are temporal systems. They act as temporal grammars, shaping how users anticipate, how they recall, how they sequence meaning, how they build narrative identity. Framing and metaphor are identity-making technologies. Frames choose what matters, invite emotions, activate oneself among many, and assign roles. Metaphors knit episodes into narratives with protagonists and arcs, creating anchors that steer action. Over time, repetition produces identity drift or stabilizes identity commitments. Counterframes enable resistance and repair. In a fast, fragmented digital world, platforms accelerate these processes. High arousal frames gain speed. Meme metaphors crystallize roles. Feedback loops normalize performance. Across cultures, identical frames recruit different selves. The practical lesson is demanding and clear. If you want to change what people do, you often must first change who they are allowed to be in the story, and do so without humiliating the self that already exists. Closing the episode, everything in this episode has built toward a simple, powerful idea. Language is not just how we communicate, it's how we become. And the world we live in today has changed the way language works. Our final episode explores the culture that has emerged from those changes. A culture shaped by everything we've learned and the place where this entire series has been leading.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Indeed, we are at the end of this chapter as well. I hope it was interesting. I hope you could take something like one or two lines with you. Again, today was heavy of this topic about communication, how we communicate, what are the tools that we use to communicate. Today's episode, especially, we've had let's say from the printing era straight to digital communication and language, where we have had a little bit of emojis and everything that we use now as online language. And now we have touched a little bit on the psychology of that communication style. I want to mention once again, this is not even one tenth of what those topics can offer. I recommend to read my articles, but I also very much recommend to do your research. Read the people that have wrote about it, who have done research and who have published the outcomes of their research. Please go and read, because this is not something that is happening in a movie. This is actually something that is happening to anyone, each one of us in our daily life. And the challenge is that we do not know, or we don't notice enough, that we are part of that experience as well, with our real life, with our real experience, with our real future. So it is not some test or some test try and error. No, this is actually real people's life, etc. So, but here, let's say again, I tried to put some sort of condensed version, the most important things, the most important takes away. I encourage to listen to the whole episode or to dissect it in many a section, as I try to do in 3 different chapters. And with that being said, I think that for this civilizational pillar, we have reached a point where I feel like it is time for me to present that new culture I am talking about since the beginning. And it is only one, it is not, it is the first one. I wanted to say I have many more that I hope that in the next few months I will be presenting. I will be, let's say, engaging in the discussion about them. So, but let's say this is our first month. This is the first month of Echoes of Change Culture in Flux podcast. And this is the time where maybe, or at least the hope, my hope is that you then understand where I want to go, what I am trying to say. Because with the whole month, we see, oh, we started here by analyzing here, and then we finished the month by doing this. So, next week or at the end of this month, I am going to present a new culture that I believe has taken shape into our society, into our lives, at least most of us. Please stay tuned or read about it and challenge me. Why not? Please comment. Say what you think. Say what you have uncovered maybe on your side, so that we can have a discussion about it and see a wider picture. But until then, here I deliver what I believe it is the outcome of my research, and I hope you enjoy it. And with that being said, because today was long, okay, so with that being said, I think it is time for us to close this episode. What is your feedback? One, feedback about chapter one, feedback about chapter two, feedback about chapter three. Then also, since the beginning, I am trying to make this as entertaining as it could be without losing focus of what we are actually aiming to do by playing music in the background, sometimes in the foreground, as background foreground, right? So I am trying to play some music to help us and to help us to digest the whole input, the whole analysis. And again, the music is purely based on these topics. If you actually listen to the lyrics, you will hear things like civilization, language, communication, how do I communicate, echoes of changes, and stuff like that. So the lyrics is purely based on the topics that I touch on this podcast. It is not some lyrics, some random lyrics from, I don't know, from some other topics. No, it is part of the project. And for those who don't know, it is not me singing. So it is not me singing. What I do is that, for example, I take today's topic from what I wrote or from what I prepared for the podcast. I write the lyrics out of it, and then I go to AI. Yes, I go to AI and I try to work as close as possible with AI and produce the music out of it. This is why sometimes you hear a man singing, sometimes you hear a woman singing, sometimes you hear both singing. Maybe you also are now recognizing the voices. But yeah, it is AI with my lyrics, and together we kind of produce all the songs that we play here in the background. In case, just in case, who knows, this is something interesting for you. Again, the links are in the bio. No subscription needed, nothing, no record of data. Simply click on the link, enjoy the music, sit back, and enjoy the podcast as well. So, with that being said, again, I wish you a lot of reflection, self-reflection. I wish you to feedback me again. I wish you an enjoyable moment, an enjoyable week ahead. Take care of you, take care of your loved ones, and hopefully we see or hear each other next week in episode number 4, like the season closing. And this is our first season that we will close. Spoiler alert, I might be releasing an episode, a monologue, where I kind of talk, explaining where do I come from about this topic, what was the intention, what have I done until now, and most importantly, where do I want to go, what is my final goal before releasing the final season episode. This is also going to be dropped here on my page, so please stay tuned. Hopefully this is helping. Okay, so have a very nice week ahead. Take care again of you, yourself, and your loved ones, and speaking to you next week or in the next few days. I almost forgot. Please like, subscribe, and comment and share this with anyone you think they could be interested in this podcast. Thank you and bye.
Through shadows that keep on shifting, with dreams that linger just out of reach. Each moment feels like a new beginning. Lessons learned, but seldom teach. In the silence, hear the heart calling. Every step echoes, we keep falling. Crafting stories from broken pieces. Finding light in the cracks that show. With every heartbeat, a new hope releases as we embrace what we don't know. Through the chaos, we find our meaning. In the depths